Good morning. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, students, and friends. Good morning, my name is Rania Harara, and I'm a senior at Georgetown University in Qatar. On behalf of my fellow students, the faculty, the staff of GAQ, it is my distinct honor to welcome you to the 11th edition of the Hiwaraat conference series. This edition is focused on decolonizing energy, the past, the present, and the future of energy justice. Before I introduce you to the Dean, who launched this acclaimed conference series shortly after his appointment 3 years ago, I would like to share some important reminders. As conveners, Georgetown University facilitates dialogue like the one that begins today in line with our long-standing speech and expression policy. To that end, out of respect for our speakers, we kindly ask that no photo or video to be taken during the sessions. Only authorized staff are permitted to take still photos. And while we're on the subject of phone, we kindly ask that everyone switch their phones to silent mode. We encourage you to focus on our in-person engagement throughout today's events. Further, we want you to know that questions from the audience will be welcomed at the designated time. We have volunteers ready with microphones to take your questions. And now, to open this essential dialogue, it is my pleasure to introduce the Dean of Georgetown University in Qatar, Dean Safwan Masri, a distinguished professor of the practice at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Dean Masri has made it his mission to bring urgent global issues into focus here in Doha. The acclaimed Hiwaraat series is one expression of that vision, placing our community at the heart of debates that reverberate far beyond academia. Before joining Georgetown in October 2022, Dean Masri served as an executive vice president for the Global Centers in Global Development at Columbia University. He was a senior research scholar at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. He held positions at Columbia Business School, Stanford University, INSEAD, and one of his most notable works is his 2017 book, Tunisia, an Arab Anomaly. Please join me in welcoming Dean Safwan Masri for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Rania. Good morning. Assalamu alaikum. Distinguished guests, colleagues, students, friends, welcome to Georgetown University in Qatar's latest edition of the Hiwaraat series, Decolonizing Energy, the Past, Present, and Future of Energy Justice. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti once wrote, "It is easy to blur the truth with a simple linguistic trick. Start your story from secondly." His warning is as relevant to energy as it is to politics. Too often, the story begins from secondly, from oil booms and technological breakthroughs, skipping over the beginning. From the very birth of the fossil fuel age, energy was bound to empire, a spoil of conquest alongside land, labor, and gold. In 1774, the East India Company extracted the first coal from Bengal under a colonial charter. A century later, oil fields across West Asia were carved up in imperial agreements, beginning with the Darcy Concession in Persia and later the Red Line Agreement among major oil companies. Coal and oil lit the boulevards of colonial metropolis, while the lands they came from remained in darkness. Fast forward to today, and the legacies endure. In an age of dazzling technology, energy access remains profoundly unequal. The imbalance is starkest in Africa. Vast reserves of oil, gas, and minerals power industries abroad. Yet nearly 600 million people, 43% of the continent's population, still live without electricity. 43% of Africans still live without electricity. What some call a resource curse is, in truth, a curse of power. Or consider Palestine. In 1967, Israel issued Military Order 159, placing electricity in the occupied territories under its control. Over time, this order entrenched a system of restrictions on fuel, repairs, and maintenance, transforming power cuts into instruments of domination. In Gaza today, children study by candlelight amid the rubble of flattened homes. In the West Bank, premature infants cling to life in incubators powered by sputtering generations. Scholars describe this as energy apartheid, a system designed to reinforce displacement and dispossession. It is against this backdrop that we gather to speak of decolonizing energy. For decades, predatory models of development have been exported wholesale to the global south, creating a narrative of progress that omits those who paid its price. At Georgetown University in Qatar, we take that challenge of redressing exclusion personally. The raison d'être of Hiwaraat is to bring into dialogue frontline perspectives that are too often kept apart. Since its launch, the series has convened 10 editions featuring policymakers, scholars, artists, writers, and the public to discuss issues including reimagining Palestine, the legacy of the Iraq invasion, Afghanistan's crossroads, and the future of energy and water. Building on our 2023 Hiwaraat, Global Energy Cultures, How Energy Shapes Our Everyday Lives, we now turn to decolonizing knowledge about energy itself as part of our faculty work within the energy humanities. The faculty you will hear from today are probing decolonial and environmental questions, helping to define an emerging field to which this conference lays claim. This work is part of GUQ's broader energy studies program, guided by Professor Rory Miller, who is leading pivotal research on energy security and on small states. That momentum will accelerate next year as GUQ launches a new major in science, technology, and international affairs, STIA. The second most popular major in the School of Foreign Service on our main campus, STIA features a dedicated track in energy and environment. It will enable our students to study climate science and renewable technologies alongside the ethics, history, and politics of energy, from the geopolitics of oil to the promise of solar and microgrids. We can pursue such bold ideas only because of the culture of inquiry fostered by Qatar Foundation. I want to extend my deepest gratitude to Her Highness Sheikha Moza bint Nasser and Her Excellency Sheikha Hind bint Hamad Al Thani, under whose leadership our faculty and students are empowered to engage in rigorous research and unconventional boundary-pushing projects. And we are honored this morning to have with us Dr. Francisco Marmolejo, President of Higher Education at Qatar Foundation. Elsewhere, questioning orthodoxy can be fraught with risk. Here, it is welcomed. The only risk lies in taking it for granted. And doing this work in Doha is itself a remarkable advantage. Qatar is a study in energy transformation. As one of the world's leading exporters of liquefied natural gas since 1997, Qatar's National Vision 2030 places energy at the heart of balancing economic growth, human development, and sustainable urban innovation. That vision also extends abroad. This year, for example, Qatar Energy signed a 15-year LNG agreement with Bangladesh, an unusually long-term, large-scale pact that strengthens energy equity by expanding access to affordable fuel for underserved communities. As we carry these themes into dialogue here in Doha, I want to thank most sincerely the faculty organizers of this conference, Dr. Vicky Gugasian, Dr. Trish Kahle, and Dr. Hiwaraat from GUQ, who also brilliantly steered our successful Hiwaraat on global energy cultures in 2023. Please join me in thanking them. I also wish to thank Dr. Nicole Rizzuto, I hope I pronounced it correctly, from Georgetown's main campus in Washington, D.C., whose collaboration reflects the growing ties between our campuses. Welcome, Nicole. And I am grateful to our speakers and to all of you for joining us today and for the imagination you bring to this gathering where scholarship, arts, and culture meet. I began with Mourid Barghouti's warning about how easy it is to blur the truth by starting from secondly. Let me close with the words of another poet, Jose Marti. To change masters is not to be free. Together, their words capture the challenge before us today. If we begin the story of energy from secondly, with new resources and technologies, while ignoring firstly, justice, equity, human dignity, we risk mistaking substitution for transformation. True progress requires more. It requires that we rethink the very structures that govern access and use. It requires that we reimagine an energy future that is sustainable and enduring, one that lights not only our cities, but our way forward. Thank you. Now, please join me in welcoming to the podium Assistant Professor Trish Kahle.
Hi, thank you, Dean Masri. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome everyone today on behalf of the Energy Humanities Program. We have an exciting day of urgent discussions, and we are very grateful for you for joining us to be part of them. An event like this one often features a few people on stage, but depends on the labor of so many others. I want to start by taking some time to thank them. My sincere thanks to all the members of the Georgetown and Doha community who have made this event possible, to the Dean's Office for providing financial support, and Andy and Kareem for making that financial support translate into paid bills, to Salman and Omar for arranging all the travel details, Maha, Reina, and the rest of the finance team, Claire, Roel, and the rest of the building operations team for the endless flexibility working on spaces and hanging artwork, to Sabrine, Zahra, Misbah, Susie, and Noor at Sears for the support of the broader special issue from which this project emerged, and to Victor, Andre, and the rest of the AV team for all of your expertise and work on the sound, visuals, and live interpretation, to Kennedy and Isaiah for your assistance with transportation, and we would also like to thank all of the service workers who make Georgetown run on a day-to-day basis, making this place a comfortable place to convene and have these discussions. I would like to issue two very special thank yous to Nala Mukbil, our Energy Humanities Program Assistant, and Joya Trash, Senior Events Coordinator at GUQ. Can both of you please come to the stage for a moment? Well, this gathering has been made possible by the unseen labor of many people here at Georgetown. It is no exaggeration to say that without Joy and Nala, this event could not have taken place at all. For the past several months, they have devoted their time, energy, and care to making this event a success, and to list everything they've done would take longer than we have for the entire day. That work is often invisible, but it is not invisible to us, and Hiwaraat, Vicky, and I are immensely grateful for everything you've done, and we wanted to offer you a token of our gratitude. We are truly honored to be able to work with you as colleagues. In the fall of 2020, I had just arrived in Doha. It was a very strange moment to do so. The restrictions of the COVID pandemic made it difficult to gather and challenging to connect with my new colleagues or to find my place in a new institution. But in November, I received an email from Farah Oruch asking if Vicky Gugasian and I would like to try to develop an interdisciplinary research program focused on the energy humanities, where we could examine energy so often thought about from the level of 30,000 feet as a dynamic and integral part of social life, cultural production, artistic practice, and historical experience. 5 years later, I can look back and say that I realize now what an excellent decision it was to say yes to this proposal, which has now developed into a research, teaching, and public programming initiative. Since our launch event in spring 2021, we have curated a set of dialogues, exhibits, and research projects which at their core are interested in how ordinary people, and particularly ordinary people within the Global South, live with, experience, contest, and represent energy. Our discussions with a global network of colleagues have ranged from the experiences of electrification in Global South cities from Doha to Mexico, to representations of oil in African media and Venezuelan literature. We have explored through the medium of art the relationship between oil and violence in Nigeria, considered the globally varied archives of energetic experience, practiced seeing energy in the everyday infrastructure all around us, and listened to the sounds of the climate crisis. We curated exhibits with regional and global artists that immersed people in the history of Lebanese electricity insecurity, the quotidian architectures of Gulf futurism, and the unsettling natures of global connectivities through undersea cables. By bringing together scholars, practitioners, artists, and writers, we have helped to open new kinds of spaces for an energy humanities oriented toward and situated within the Global South, one of the first such initiatives in the world. These conversations have been facilitated by our location in Doha, a city deeply engaged with global artistic conversations, situated at a critical node of global processes of migration and energy, and a place filled with the rich creative possibilities generated by Gulf futurisms. The subject of today's forum, Decolonizing Energy, the Past, Present, and Future of Energy Justice, is in many ways a natural outgrowth of this past work. Our discussions continually led us back to the question of frameworks, what ways of engaging with and thinking about energy would allow us to imagine new ways of living in the world, or, to paraphrase the historian Vince Brown, how could we question our received ways of thinking about energy and instead look differently, allowing us to see the world around us more clearly? We were acutely aware of energy studies' long-standing overrepresentation of Europe and North America, and of the tendency to treat global energy studies as a question of resource management. These were inadequate tools to meet the challenges of the present. But equally, to locate energy humanities in the Global South was necessarily to confront the continual colonial legacies and colonial presence. During our last major forum, in December 2023, 3 months into a genocide which has now continued for almost two full and intolerable years, we convened a group of Palestinian scholars to discuss decolonial energy struggles in Palestine and beyond. Energy systems and colonial power, these scholars highlighted, from Israel's overt weaponization of energy access in Palestine to the European Union's complicity in the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara, to green extractivism in the occupied Golan Heights, all underscored the dual need for action to end colonial energy violence alongside a reimagination of energy that would allow us to imagine energy systems which were not premised on exploitation, extractivism, and theft, which did not treat the right of some as disposable to power the decarbonization of others. We use this invocation to turn back to a group of thinkers we had mostly encountered in other contexts outside of the energy humanities, the 20th century thinkers who tried to analyze colonialism in order to end it, who sought out new ways of living in the world, who foregrounded indigenous ways of knowing and relating. This long tradition of decolonial theory is varied, emerging from both settler and exploitation colonies, circulating in different languages, and sometimes expressed through action before it is expressed in words. But in its many forms, this body of knowledge offers us critical and imaginative tools for confronting our contemporary situation of climate crisis, rising authoritarianism, and renewed imperial adventurism. For imagining a world, as Pascal Martin Taillou, our artist today, who will be today's keynote, articulated in a discussion with students on Thursday, we don't just want to survive, we want to live as full human beings. For much of decolonial theory at its core is driven by the desire to reimagine our humanity anew. The Western imagination of humanity, the rational Enlightenment man, had, in the words of Frantz Fanon, author of perhaps the most widely read work of decolonial theory, The Wretched of the Earth, quote, produced only a series of negations of man and an avalanche of murders. The task of imagining the world anew was also to create the whole man, man is Fanon's term, whom Europe had been incapable of bringing to its triumphant birth. And Aimé Césaire, Fanon's one-time teacher, likewise insisted that colonialism had perverted the purpose of human interaction and connection, the exchange of energies. Between colonization and civilization, he wrote, there is an infinite distance. Out of colonialism could not come a single human value. In Fanon's conclusion to Wretched of the Earth, he writes, come, comrades, the European game is finally over. We must find something else. For Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity, we must make a new start, develop new ways of thinking, and endeavor to create a new human being. This invocation invites us to undertake the project of decolonizing our energy imaginations. We hope that today you will encounter scholars, makers, artists, and writers who embody the spirit of searching out the full human being, one that is not the Enlightenment man apart from nature, but a person imagined relationally. We invite you to imagine with us worlds and humanities beyond extractivism. Now I would like to turn to our first event of the day, a live podcast recording building on a longer series of recordings we've made over the years, featuring 4 of the world's leading scholars in the energy humanities. I will introduce each of them and then invite them all onto the stage. Our first speaker is Elizabeth DeLoughrey, who is professor in the English department at the University of California, Los Angeles, with an affiliation with the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, who works in the fields of Caribbean, Pacific Island, Indigenous, and post-colonial studies, with an emphasis on militarism and ocean ecologies. She is the co-editor of multiple volumes on post-colonial eco-criticism, as well as the author of Roots and Roots, Navigating Caribbean and Pacific Island Literatures, and Allegories of the Anthropocene. She has received awards from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship, the Mellon Sawyer Foundation, the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society in Munich, among others. Her current work is on the visual logics of US militarism across the Pacific, as well as the extractive discourses of deep-sea mining. Our second speaker is Gökçe Günel, who is associate professor in anthropology at Rice University. Her research investigates how infrastructure transforms amid energy and climate-related challenges. Her first book, Spaceship in the Desert, Energy, Climate Change, and Urban Design in Abu Dhabi, was published by Duke University Press in 2019, and it focuses on the construction of renewable energy and clean technology infrastructures in the United Arab Emirates, more specifically concentrating on the Masdar City project. Her most recent book, All of the Above, A Global Future of Energy, forthcoming from Duke University Press in 2026, analyzes how energy infrastructures shape South-South relations. Dr. Günel co-authored a manifesto for patchwork ethnography in 2020 and co-leads patchwork ethnography, a methodological guide of which is forthcoming in 2026. Next, Hannah Appel is an economic anthropologist interested in transnational capitalism and finance, debt and debtors unions, the African continent's place in global capitalism, the economic imagination, anti-capitalist and abolitionist social movements. Her research and teaching interests are guided by the economic imagination. What does it mean to understand racial capitalism ethnographically and to work actively to undo it? And she is the author of The Licit Lives of Capitalism, US Oil in Equatorial Guinea. And finally, Jennifer Wenzel is jointly appointed in the Department of English and Comparative Literature and the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. She is an affiliate of the Columbia Climate School. Her first book, Bulletproof, Afterlives of Anti-Colonial Prophecy in South Africa and Beyond, published by Chicago and KwaZulu-Natal in 2009, was awarded honorable mention for the Perkins Prize by the International Society for the Study of Narrative. Her recent monograph, The Disposition of Nature, Environmental Crisis in World Literature, was published by Fordham in 2020 and was a finalist for the 2020 Book Prize by the Association for the Study of the Arts and of the Present, and was shortlisted for the 2022 Eco-Criticism Book Prize awarded by the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment. Her essays on post-colonial theory, environmental and energy humanities, memory studies, and African and South Asian literatures have appeared in journals including Aleph, Cultural Critique, Modern Fiction Studies, Novel, PMLA, Post-Colonial Studies, Public Culture, and more. She has held fellowships from the Mellon Foundation, ACLS, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Princeton University Davis Center for Historical Studies, and she is currently at work on a new book project, The Fossil-Fueled Imagination: How and Why to Read for Energy. Jennifer was also part of our program's initial webinar back in the pandemic days of 2021, so it's especially meaningful for her to be here with us today. Would you all please come join me on stage? All right, so to look at energy through the lens of decolonial theory seems like almost an obvious move, given the centrality, for example, of questions of resource sovereignty in the 20th century as the British, French, German, Dutch, and Portuguese empires collapsed and were defeated, and a new wave of post-colonial nations emerged. Yet historically, within the field of energy studies, there had been less engagement between these two fields than one might expect, though this has begun to change in recent years. And while the question of resource sovereignty is certainly a central part of the discussion of what it means to decolonize energy, I hope today you will also have the opportunity to engage with ways of thinking about the intersection between energy and decolonization that push us past the limits of the transitioning of control over resources from a colonial power to a post-colonial state. Decolonial thinkers often invite us to imagine something new rather than reproducing the extractivist logics which have drawn us to this point. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by these scholars in the field of energy humanities whose work, oh no, my notes have gotten out of order. You'll have to wait to find out. Okay, we're back on track. Whose work engages deeply and in different ways with the intersection between energy and decoloniality. So how this will work is I'm going to pose a series of questions to our guests over the next 45 minutes or so, and then I will turn it over to the audience. So as we're speaking, please prepare your questions. We want to make sure this is an opportunity for meaningful engagement. And in the meantime, because we are recording live for a podcast that will be distributed, please remember to silence your phones if you forgot to do so when Rania asked you to earlier. So thank you again for being with us today. And I was hoping to get us started that you could each speak a little bit about how you understand that intersection between energy and decoloniality. Any overlaps or co-constitutions you perceive in your work, or how these concepts have appeared in your own research. How do you yourselves enter into this field? And we can sort of use that as a point of departure to continue the conversation. So I don't know who would like to start first. I didn't get that far.
Well, I mean, I can start, if only because Dean Masri's citation of Barghouti on starting from secondly is also quoted in a photo essay book about the Niger Delta called Curse of the Black Gold, 50 Years of Oil in the Niger Delta. And it's that line from Barghouti about starting from secondly is quoted by the Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie, right? And so what I'm asking us to think about here is a kind of process of citation about how his statement about colonialism is cited to make sense of what's happening in post-colonial Nigeria, right? And so that I see that process of citation, of learning from one struggle, learning from a decolonization struggle in the mid-20th century to think about what's happening in Nigeria with regard to oil in the early 20th century as this process of one movement learning from another, which to me is kind of intellectually satisfying, if only because it mirrors a bit the modularity of the energy industry itself, right? So practices developed in California moved to Saudi Arabia, practices developed in Texas moved to Canada. So there's a kind of complementarity between the way that extractive industries have worked and the way that critical discourse about them has worked, either from space to space or in different kinds of struggles. So that's one thing I would say about thinking about the connection between those fields. Yeah.
I can follow. Yeah. I was also so happy to hear the Barghouti quote. But I think one thing that I would say is Talal Asad, drawing on Foucault, said that kind of anthropology or ethnographic ways of knowing are a mode of power, and therefore it might be best strategically here in terms of decoloniality to use that mode of power to know more about that which we want more power over. So taking that from Professor Assad seriously, the ethnography I did of the oil industry in Equatorial Guinea was really an ethnography of the US oil industry. So the book is not about Equatorial Guinea per se, but about what these big oil majors from the United States were doing in Equatorial Guinea, live mic, and what they were bringing around with them. And pardon me, I prepared a little bit, so as I age, I'm gonna put on my glasses and speak to you from those notes. So my research with the US oil and gas companies in Equatorial Guinea really showed me both the durability and what you just said, the transnational mobility of colonial relationships, but in the present, right? Or what Ann Stoler called imperial debris, and how imperial debris shapes the contemporary oil and gas industry, whether that's in the terms of production sharing contracts. My book also talks about marriage contracts, which US employees are allowed to bring their spouses, who is not allowed to bring their spouses, what kinds of moral valence that gives to the transnational oil industry, subcontracting. And I want to illustrate this relationship between, this is coloniality now, a kind of coloniality, a durable coloniality, a transnational coloniality that these US companies bring with them from place to place. I want to just illustrate that by offering one story. So I spent some time on offshore rigs while I was in Equatorial Guinea, and it was a surprise to me, though now I am embarrassed that it was a surprise, that 1 in every 3 workers on those rigs was Filipino. Again, I am off the shores of Central Africa in Equatorial Guinea. So why? What is the origin story? And obviously this is an origin story relevant to the Gulf as well. So in World War I, the United States, of course, fought in World War I. The United States was still a segregated country, but black soldiers were invited to fight, right? Often included predatorily in violence, even though we were still in a time of segregation. But once World War I was over, the Navy was resegregated. The US Navy was resegregated, and the Philippines was a colony of the United States at the time. So in order to fill in for the labor that black soldiers had previously done in the Navy specifically, Filipino men were offered US naval training, and if you served in the Navy for 3 years, then you could become a citizen. So they got all of this English language nautical training, right? And it was this very coercive, right? Serve on behalf of US empire, serve on behalf of your imperial master, and you can become a citizen of this place. So today, that Filipino men are 1 in 3 workers at sea, shows us how the labor markets and the transnational oil and gas industry are completely caught up in colonial histories, broadly conceived, whether that's US empire in the Philippines or Jim Crow in the United States, right? Jim Crow segregation in the United States. And this is today. This is right now. So this is not like, let's think in a kind of abstract way about how colonial conditions make labor markets, right? Colonial conditions make labor markets right here today. So that was the kind of thrust of trying to understand the kinds of coloniality that US empire via the US oil majors bring with them from place to place in an effort to try eventually to have more power over it.
Hey, I can continue, I think, because it was a pleasure to hear all your remarks, and also it's a pleasure to follow an ethnographer. So because what I was going to say was kind of echoing Hannah's comments, in the sense that I think as an ethnographer myself, one of the things I've prioritized has been to be able to depict both the conceptual and the empirical ways in which colonial relations manifest themselves in the contemporary era. And studying energy infrastructure has been particularly helpful for doing that. And I've, as you kindly summarized in the introduction, I now did 2 projects. I've now completed 2 projects that both concentrate on energy infrastructure. And in both, I've found colonial legacies manifesting themselves in complementary but slightly different ways. So in the first project, which was looking at economic diversification efforts in the UAE, where the UAE government invested in renewable energy, clean technology infrastructure, I came across a fascination with the power of technology and the power and the promise that technology is going to solve all our problems. But when I was doing research there, I came across one engineer from Egyptian origin who was working at Masdar, and that was his first job, and he had just arrived there. He was very enthusiastic about participating in the making of a clean technology sector. And he said, we've always had this faith in solar power here, and we believe that solar power is going to enable us to sort of skip over the sort of the problems with the future, sort of the declining reserves, or the possibility that the oil price is no longer going to be a reliable resource for us. But he said, but I came here and I've realized that mud and dust and humidity on solar panels is making it impossible for us to have the efficiency that we've aspired for. So then I asked him, I said, but you have this belief in technology, so how did you solve this problem? He said, oh yeah, we've solved it really easily. We call it a man with a brush. And so there was this man with a brush, and actually a range of men with brushes going around and cleaning solar panels on a daily basis in order to achieve the kind of efficiency that had been dreamed of when the project had first been started. And one of the sort of the ironies, I guess, of this is that a Masdar city was imagined as a sort of like a utopian city in the desert, and it was often the people who worked on the project called it a spaceship in the desert. And unfortunately, many of the people who were providing the kind of labor that enabled the city were not necessarily as imagined as astronauts on that spaceship, but as people who would be left behind once that spaceship actually launched. And actually this was not necessarily something that was invisible to the people who were working there. Everyone was aware of this, these various inequalities, but they didn't know what to do with them. They didn't know how to resolve them. So I don't necessarily want to paint people as necessarily being ignorant of what they were participating in, but feeling lost as to how to resolve those problems. And then now, as I've finished the second project, I saw kind of maybe perhaps colonial legacies manifesting themselves in slightly different ways. So now my current book focuses on a Turkish-built floating power plant that produces electricity in Ghana. And the floating power plant was initially envisioned as a way to solve Iraq's electricity struggles after the invasion, after the US invasion. So, but if you kind of look a little further into the history of why this happened and why Iraq needed a floating power plant in the first place, you quickly go to the first Gulf War and see how Iraq's well-functioning modern electricity grid was completely decimated by the US military, to the extent that the US Air Force actually wrote papers saying, we should never ever do this again, because this was not a feasible strategy even for militaristic purposes. And so 15 years later, a ship that was built in Istanbul and that benefited from the sort of the 2008 crisis, where the ship prices declined significantly, was sort of turned into a power plant and sent to Basra to power, what was, I guess, what had been Camp Buka, the sort of the Basra, basically all of the Basra grid, I should say. So then I see how that ship, which is a product of war, finds use for itself in places like Ghana or all across the global south, places that have unmet electricity demands, and then sort of reasserts their use or reasserts their necessity in places where the grids need maintenance and repair, where there's need for investment in perhaps permanent electricity infrastructure. maybe I'll end there because that's a good long summary already.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming and thank you for this panel. I mean, this is really, I'm very jet lagged, but already my head is already spinning. One of the things that I've been taking from the readings for our workshop tomorrow and also in our conversations today is to think through the way that energy humanities is necessarily comparative, right? So as you started out, Jennifer, thinking through these kind of comparative contexts and the way in which certain kinds of infrastructures travel, right? Whether we're thinking about, transatlantic to across the Indian Ocean, and the way in which certain kinds of labor practices are then met, certain kind of racial hierarchies are repeated and reinforced in diverse spaces. And I've taken I read in a very interdisciplinary way as a literary scholar, so I'm finding that the kind of conceptual, the empirical, the infrastructure, historical, the comparative empire work is very important. One of the things for me, and I was also inspired to hear our opening, the Dean opened with two different poets, right, to think through the way in which certain kinds of aesthetics and narrative storytelling practices are really important for thinking about energy humanities. And to back up, to give an example, about 25 years ago, the Indian writer Amitav Ghosh came out with a very important article that said if all of the networks that we're enmeshed in, whether we're in this auditorium, the electricity that's fueling this, all of the kind of energy that fueled our travel to here, if we're enmeshed in all of these networks, why don't we have a robust body of literature that is actually about oil extraction, right? If that's really kind of undergirding our militarism, all of these elements. So how do we represent that? And that was a real inspiration to a lot of us who are trained in post-colonial studies, especially from the 90s onwards, to think through, why is this that we have this infrastructure that's invisible to us, right? And what does that demand from us, both in terms of recognizing it, but also how to tell stories about it. So then fast forward 25 years later, Amitav Ghosh's his series of articles and then his book, The Great Derangement, also took up the same question. So if we know that we're in an existential crisis that some people are calling the Anthropocene, and it's created by the fossil fuel industry, and I should mention, because this is erased from a lot of records, the US military is the single largest institutional contributor to climate change on the planet. So while we talk about this nation or that nation or this nation, that nation, it's actually the US military that is doing this, which is undergirding all these different extractive industries. And in fact, it's impossible in some ways to think through an extractive industry that isn't undergirded by some kind of militarism. So the second question that he raised then a few decades later was that if we're in this existential crisis that some call the Anthropocene, why don't we have these great climate change novels that are thinking through this? And by great, I mean, he was called to task for this by many people. He meant not popular fiction, right? He meant not science fiction. We have plenty of science fiction out there that is thinking about apocalyptic endings. So he's raised these questions for me that I think as a literary scholar are really important to think through, okay, why are these stories not told in these particular ways? But mostly my question in response to that was that more engagement with literature, especially poetry from the Global South, actually will tell a different story, right? So some of these other questions, and I think we'll be having a conversation tomorrow in our workshop, how certain kinds of forms of vernacular, poetry, music, certain kinds of storytelling actually are very engaged with this, but they're not necessarily marketed by the big publishing houses, and they're not necessarily distributed in the same networks, right, that we may be engaged with. And I want to bring up a little bit of the kind of other side to how I understand the energy humanities, which is the work that I've been doing in Pacific Island representations of the nuclear testing program that went on from 1946 on to 1996 by the French. So you had American and British and French nuclear testing. French, of course, started out in Algeria, right? They get kicked out of Algeria and then they go to continue it out in the Pacific. So there's another side to the way I'm thinking about energy. It's not just the fossil fuel industries and their production, but the way in which certain kinds of communities are experiencing the turn towards nuclear power and nuclear violence in their own homelands, right? And so the other element too that I would bring in is that there are quite a few Native American writers who have written extensively, right, about the experience of their uranium mining, right, on their own land. And then the connection, and in fact, at the 50th anniversary of the Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombings, a community of Dene or Navajo people traveled to Japan to offer their apologies, right? So the US didn't offer an apology, but the indigenous communities who felt a kinship to their own land, including their own minerals, felt the obligation and the care in order to make that kind of gesture. And so part of the work that I'm thinking through is what are our, beyond like the infrastructure and the labor, and these are all, I don't want to minimize those are absolutely integral, but what are the kind of more than human connections to land that we can, and minerals and extraction, and to think about those as participants in this story, right? So it's a more than human story. It's a way of telling stories that engage with, Hannah Appel, who's the great Maori poet from New Zealand, has a beautiful poem that came out after the bombings in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, a poem called No Ordinary Sun, and it was a whole question about how could the representation of the solar, which is a figure, a deity and a creative figure in Maori and indigenous cosmologies of the Pacific, then be harnessed into such a necropolitical, violence, right? And then violence that knows no endings, right? Because of the way in which irradiation is taken up by the body and then passed on generation to generation. So one of the ways in which, in his imagination, and some of the other Maori poets and writers like James George and others have engaged with this, is actually to bring in models of indigenous cosmologies and then incorporate in certain kinds of nuclear violence within those, right? And so the work that I'm thinking through, inspired by these poets and these novels, is to think through imagining energy otherwise, energy as a kind of maybe a process of cosmology, a process of origin stories, a process of animated landscapes and minerals, and other ways of telling those stories alongside the infrastructural and the labor and the military networks in which we're all enmeshed.
Yeah, I think picking up on this point about both, I think there are different versions of this that have emerged through your answers of questions about representation or visibility, I think, in other contexts, right? And I wonder if we could take a second to think about sort of the stakes of visibility or representation, sort of what are the different purposes you see that sort of being mobilized toward. I think you just gave us some good examples here. But I think in some ways, right, part of the task of a lot of people who work, for example, in infrastructure studies is to make these things visible. But I think for people who maybe are not quite as enmeshed in that, those discussions or scholarship, like the political, ethical, cultural stakes of representation or visibility might not be as obvious. And do you think you could maybe just offer some thoughts on that? And then maybe we can get to another thread, which I saw here, which were questions about how things are circulating.
I can go really quickly in answer to that, in part because we have many wonderful colleagues from Nigeria here, and my answer about visibility from Equatorial Guinea has to do with Nigeria. So Nigeria and the Niger Delta, which has come up several times, to these traveling oil industry professionals, so many of them that I worked with in Equatorial Guinea, they had lived in Nigeria, they had lived in Israel, they had lived in Indonesia, right? Their lives were these kind of itinerant lives around the world's oil extraction sites. But many of them narrated Nigeria as a model failure, right? And why was it a failure? It was a failure because what has happened in the Delta, thanks in such large part to poets and artists and musicians and excellent scholarship, has been so visible. And the extraordinary violence of Shell, among other companies, Chevron, has been so visible. So when they came to Equatorial Guinea, many of them having lived there, but all of them having been exposed to that failure, they found there is oil onshore in Equatorial Guinea. There are subterranean hydrocarbons, but the industry has decided not to go for them, right? This is the secondly point. Instead, all oil in Equatorial Guinea is offshore, and they paint the offshore as a technological miracle, right? They say, oh, because now we have the technology, these wells are going to be the most. That is not why they made the choice to go after the offshore wells. They made the choice to go after the offshore wells because they were hoping for invisibility, and the secondly of the technological genius seemed to cover their tracks. So I guess for me, in the work that I've done that has been most directly about the energy industry, trying to the best of my ability, alongside many other scholars and authors and singers, and to make so invisibility is often itself made. It doesn't inhere in anything, right? So what is the work that the US oil industry was doing to make the offshore invisible, to say there's nobody out there, we don't need to worry about displacing communities, we don't need to worry about corporate social responsibility because we're in the middle of the ocean. They bring thousands of people out there every year. And how do they bring Ecuador-Guineans out there? Do they not bring Ecuador-Guineans out there? How are they trying to create this distance between themselves and the climate change that they are responsible for, among other immediate impacts? Part of it is by touting apparent technological innovations. That is not what the offshore was in Equatorial Guinea. All of them said there's plenty of onshore oil, we could go for onshore oil. The only thing they were doing is try to render their work invisible because of what they had learned from Nigeria. And so, in some ways that's a very straightforward accounting of visibility, but it was so interesting that there was such an active project and an open project. It wasn't like I had to dig for this, right? This is what people were telling me. We are trying to make as much separation as we possibly can. And so to say, no, that's not empirically true, that's not theoretically true, that's not geopolitically true, and people need to understand the political project that is invisibilization.
Can I pick up on that? Yeah, I think whenever we talk about oil being, or anything being invisible, I understand invisibility in a kind of dialectic relationship with visibility and with hypervisibility, right? And so, I wrote long ago that oil is everywhere and nowhere, not so much invisible as unseen, right? And so I think questions of invisibility and visibility have to be coupled with the question or just the fact that what you see depends on where you stand. So for folks in sites of extraction, oil is not invisible, right? It's hypervisible. And I think also what you see depends on when you stand, right? So I'm thinking of the work of the American historian Matthew Huber, who writes about the oil industry in the US before the oil shock of the 1970s, and the kind of PR of oil companies before 1970s was to say, oil is everywhere. Oil is in your food. Oil is in plastic. Look at all of the things that oil makes possible. And it was, so he talks about a rhythm of invisibilization that comes after the shock of the 70s, when a US lifestyle based on mass consumption of oil becomes unaffordable, right? So, and I think that dynamic of visibility and invisibility and hypervisibility also is connected to what Liz was saying about Amitav Ghosh, right? That he makes the same argument about oil in 1992 that he does about climate change in 2015, that there's no literature about it. Mm-hmm. And I think he's kind of wrong. And what I mean by that in the context of visibility is, if we're thinking about these regimes of visibility, right, how visibility is constructed, it turns out that if you start reading for oil, if you start reading for climate, it's already there in literature. It's just not something that we've been reading for, right? Now, for sure, there's lots more climate fiction now than there was when he was writing in 2015. And for sure, there's still a kind of question of prestige of what kind of writing gets valued. But I guess as a literature scholar, I understand part of my project, both in reading literature and in reading theoretical text, as looking again at text to see how can we see differently for concerns that may not have been top of mind for critics in previous generations. So, and that for me as a literature professor is coupled with kind of like what Hannah and others were talking about of, I think it's more important to me that my students learn to read for oil in their daily lives than reading for oil and literature, if that makes sense. So that project of sitting in this room and thinking about how oil and other energy is flowing through it is a kind of fundamental thing that I do.
I can add to actually both of these comments here. One of the things that I learned in my process of pursuing this anthology about the deep sea, produced by the X Prize Foundation, which is based in Culver City, which is close to where I live in Los Angeles, is that they had done, it was an ocean anthology, it came out in 2019, and they had commissioned a number of sci-fi or SF writers from around the world, primarily women, queer, young, and a series of artists who would then illustrate the short stories. And what they had asked these writers to do was to imagine underwater worlds, right? And so X Prize put out this money. I talked with one of the authors, Nala Hopkinson, and asked her about it, and she said, we're given these criteria, and you had to imagine a techno-optimistic future, you had to imagine oil cleanup technologies, you had to imagine something that wasn't too far in the future, so it would be graspable, but in something that would come up with new technologies, and thinking about AI. And what I found out by doing a little bit of digging is that X Prize was actually Shell Oil, right? And so Shell is now in this big push to map the ocean floors because this is their new frontier. And to go back to a point that Hannah was making, in the process of researching this and reading a lot of literature coming out by the oil industry, is that they need a social license to operate, right? Which is to say some kind of consent, a social consent from a community. Okay, we're going to come in and we're going to do this oil drilling, and we'll bring you jobs, and we'll bring you education, and we'll build you a soccer field, and all the kind of things that they do. And one of the things that they're challenged with is that if you're in the deep sea, how then do you create a social license to operate? So to me, what was really interesting as a literary scholar is that they actually really wanted creative writers to come up with possibilities, and they're using them, right? So it's not to say that the aesthetics becomes a place outside of these relations of power, but they can actually be appropriated. And so one of the things I've been working a lot in what we call the environmental humanities, and a huge part of those conversations are about the kind of the vitality of matter. They're about thinking about the haptic, thinking about other kinds of sensing that certainly in Western contexts, you have a priority over the kind of visual and the written, and yet to think through other ways of knowing that are through the body, ways of knowing that are through historical ancestry, right, through other kinds of imagining. And one of the things that was shocking for me was to look at this list of criteria that Shell wanted them to write about, and they wanted to know about other ways of knowing, they wanted to know about haptic, and they were asking these authors to imagine, for instance, merging into the body of an octopus, merging into the body of a Weddell seal. These come up in a number of the stories. So I started thinking through, like, what is this move that we're doing as literary scholars, thinking through, SF as this possibility and imagining otherwise, and really attributing a kind of liberatory and even utopian possibility to those kinds of aesthetics, when actually the oil companies are just as interested in those possibilities because they're extractive to them, right? So to me, that raises these really interesting questions about where we're pushing, investing our energy in terms of possibilities for imagining extraction otherwise. But the interesting thing was, I thought, okay, well now they've harnessed all this imagination. They've had these 18 writers imagine these futures, and they're quite diverse in and of themselves. So I wrote an article about it. I've been teaching this collection with my students for a number of years, and then one year I went to put it back on the syllabus, and the link was gone. And so I called them. I sent them emails. I said, this, anthology, I've been teaching it, where is it? And no one would reply to me. And this was after my article came out critiquing them. And I thought, oh my God, how could they care what a literature scholar thinks about their collection? But I thought that's exactly what the point is for this anthology, right? There was some kind of recognition, right? Even, so there, and a lot of, when I talk to my friends who work in business school and other areas, they're like, oh, no, this is exactly how this works, right? You do this kind of marketing, and you assess the public, and then a response, and then you correct, right? And so sometimes, I think because, especially in the US, we're so marginalized as working in the humanities, and this is why we, one of the reasons that contributes to ocean humanities, energy humanities, or environmental humanities, right? There's a kind of rebranding at work, and that's certainly the context in very neoliberal institutions like where I work. But there's also a sense that there's a certain kind of knowledge, right, that can be appropriated that's very important for these industries as well.
Maybe I'll pick up on the sort of the emphasis on narratives and say something about how certain dominant narratives shape the ways in which we imagine energy futures. And I think the most dominant narrative, or one of the most dominant anyway, energy narratives we see today is the idea of energy transition. And while I was working on my last book, I became quite fascinated with why energy transition is such a dominant narrative and what it means for us to sort of use it, colloquially, what kinds of points we're making when we imagine a future energy transition or take for granted that past energy transitions have taken place. And I came across some research that actually looked at whale oil, because whale oil is one of the kind of, maybe to connect it with your ocean humanities comment, is whale oil is something that's imagined as having been, forgotten thanks to fossil fuels. So there were a lot of narratives in the early 20th century, for sure, that said fossil fuels saved the whales. And so we should be sort of thankful that there wasn't more hunting of the whales, because oil was now powering our industries and providing illumination as well. And so, but actually, when you look at how whale populations have been affected by fossil fuels, you encounter a very different kind of reality. And in fact, once fossil fuels became operational, fossil fuel-powered ships were able to hunt more whales, and so in fact, fossil fuel consumption increased the killing of the whales. And perhaps the most ironic moment is in the 1970s, when a moratorium on whale hunting was about to be implemented, but at that point, whale oil was being used as a lubricant for jet engines. And because of that, there was a huge stocking of whale oil, and the killing of the whales actually reached its peak in that moment. So you can see how the development of the jet engine and development of whale oil were in symbiosis with each other, and they developed, they co-evolved. And so there was actually no transition from whale oil to fossil fuels until there was policy transition. So until there was a sort of popular protest, until there was an actual decision made to no longer hunt whales, there was no end to their consumption. So I think that history illustrates to us what the kind of, in some ways, we can infer what the future may hold in that case, right? So to imagine that there was going to be stages where we just first use fossil fuels for the next 50 years and then move to renewables and then move to hydrogen, etc. These are kinds of narratives that circulate in the energy industry. And obviously the orders in which these fuels are being mobilized change. I mean, these days everyone thinks that small modular reactors are going to be the next fuel source. But to imagine our histories and futures in these stages perhaps also creates a certain kind of invisibility, where we no longer ask what is it that we're actually consuming, and what is the kind of future that we should expect from these patterns of consumption.
Yeah. I think that's in some ways is this sort of thinking about the way that narrative constructs both our relationship to the past as well as to the future is actually a great sort of moment to come back to sort of the other. So we have sort of the temporal aspect of the question, but also sort of the geographical element of questions about circulation. And so in particular, sort of the history of decolonization, the theoretical text, the literature, and other forms of cultural representation, as well as the practices of decolonization, have always had a global form of circulation, right? People, as you all were sort of pointing out in some of your opening comments, right? People are taking lessons from one place, or taking texts or images or ideas from one place, using them in others. But it also is true that they are sort of sometimes running along these other threads, often things that are sort of made by empire. I think Frantz Fanon is a great example of this, right? Born in Martinique, moves to France, then to Algeria, right? And so it's a form of global circuit, and then his life continues on after that. But these are sort of modes of mobility that are sort of along the circuits of the French Empire. And I'm sort of curious thinking about the ways that the sort of circulations of decolonial thought are being shaped by different forms of migration, practices of translation, relations that are often themselves being produced through empire, which are being shaped by histories of the particular, as well as extended through long traditions of internationalism. And so when we're sort of thinking about decolonial theory as a whole, we might sort of think about the different kinds of traditions we see sort of resonating in the areas of work that we're doing. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about maybe if rather than talking about decolonial theory as sort of a universal whole, to sort of think about the different sort of resonant theories that are relevant for the work that you've been doing.
Should I go?
Yes.
Okay. So my PhD is in anthropology, and I was trained by a wonderful man named James Ferguson. May he rest in peace. He just died very recently, far too young. But I was trained in a great tradition of, I wouldn't call it decolonial, but I would call it anti-colonial African anthropology. And I am also from the United States, born and raised, though I have lived in many other places. And so in the United States, we learn about race and racism, but it's very difficult to learn or think about US empire. Maybe once you get to college and you take classes with people like these, right? But it's not something that you grow up learning about. But you do grow up learning about race and racism. So there was a way that being a kid and then a young adult, an adult in the United States, I was taught to think about segregation, race, racism, anti-blackness. And then being trained in Africanist anthropology, I was taught to think about colonialism in a certain way. And I think that it was really actually my exposure when I got to UCLA, so very recently in my life, only over the last 12 years or so, my exposure to the Black radical tradition. My primary exposure to that, my first exposure to that, was a really deep reading of Cedric Robinson's book, Black Marxism, but that really insists that what I had held separate in my own life, and I had brought that separateness as kind of baggage along with me into my academic career, was in fact were part of conjoined histories, and you have to be able to think about race and racism and white supremacy and anti-blackness in Africa and on the African continent, and you also have to be able to think about empire and imperialism and colonialism in the United States and of course US empire. And I think that the eventual project that I did for that book in Equatorial Guinea really forced me to bring those two things together, because again, the mobility of Jim Crow segregation that the US was bringing with it in its labor regimes, and what Stoller calls imperial debris that was so present everywhere in Equatorial Guinea, you could really see them as a conjoined, a kind of broader longue durée history. So I will bring that then to the traveling literature that I want to use, which is Cedric Robinson, who is often maligned for having a somewhat romantic and ignorant view of the African continent. But there's a phenomenal article by Yusuf Al-Balushi, a colleague of ours in the UC system, that gives the kind of Africanist genealogy of Cedric Robinson's work, not only through folks in South Africa who are best known, Oliver Cromwell Cox, right? It was in South Africa and South African apartheid that many people started bringing this term, racial capitalism, to describe what was going on in South Africa, but also actually through the Dar es Salaam school. Right? So Samir Amin and Giovanni Arrighi and Cedric Robinson passing through the Dar school in Tanzania and learning from those world systems thinkers. So if I were to talk about the kinds of circulating decolonial knowledge that have been most productive and formative to my own thinking, I would probably name Cedric Robinson and Black Marxism. And I think that book is really an effort to decolonize Marxism, not to abolish Marxism, right? But to decolonize Marxism and what that looks like. but then to note, as is true of any one person we name, that they have such far-reaching teachers. And so, right, somebody noted the Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon relationship earlier, right? And that is also the case for Cedric Robinson. And again, I will just shout out Yusuf al-Baluchi. I wish I could remember the name of the article, but everybody should look up. It's a phenomenal, kind of intellectual genealogy of Cedric Robinson from the African continent. So that's what I would say.
I can jump in, but I'm going to go the other way. This is, so thank you for the question. I think one of the things that when I read the question, I was wondering if you were referring to Said's work, right, in terms of traveling theory. And a lot of the discourses that I was trained in the 90s were about these questions about thinking about kind of cosmopolitanism in relationship to literary scholars, kind of comparativism. My training was in feminist theory at the University of York in England, and then I did Maori studies in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and then a PhD in the US in post-colonial women's literature. So I had the same kind of experience that Hannah, you were describing. Kind of, I had to, what Suviak calls unlearning my privilege as loss, is actually having to leave the country to then actually see a lot of the things that were structured to, the way I was, the kind of knowledge systems that I was incorporated into. But one of the things that I, as a product of the PhD in the 1990s, when everything was turned into globalization studies, diaspora studies, all this thing about mobility, one of the things I wrote about a long time ago was to think through that if we're overemphasizing mobility, and I'm a comparativist. I mean, my work has been Caribbean, Pacific, and within the subframes of that is to think through diasporic, especially Black diasporic histories in the Caribbean, and then indigenous diasporic traditions in the Pacific. So the kind of question was, how do you then have a sense of place and belonging if you're part of a diaspora, right, in terms of that land, and then what does land mean to you, and what does transoceanic migration mean to you, right? So unlike the way the mining industries, and I'm thinking about this transition as well to deep sea mining, are creating the ocean as a kind of new frontier and as all this techno-optimism that now we suddenly have the ability to extract these nodules. They don't. I'll just say it's a shell game, and they're looking for investment, and they actually don't have the technologies, nor is it economically feasible. But I'll come back to that. What I want to circle back to is this idea of mobility and migration. So one of the concerns that I had in writing in the 90s was that, okay, so everything was about thinking through, especially Atlantic Ocean, Indian Ocean migration, but where does that leave figures of the indigenous, figures of women, right? So, and that's the critique of Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic, which is very important for my generation of scholars, which was to think through, Gilroy is very concerned about the kind of the abjection of Middle Passage narratives, and to think through how can we think about a kind of Black cosmopolitanism in a radical tradition, right? And so he's made a really important, influenced a whole generation of us in thinking about this, but so women disappear from that narrative, right? And so for me as a literary scholar, I was wondering, why am I reading all these Caribbean women writers who the minute the protagonist goes to migrate, the story ends? She's never depicted on a boat going across, right? She's not having these cosmopolitan experiences on the Windrush or any of these kind of transatlantic things. So part of when so as much as I'm invested in this idea of kind of comparativism and mobility and traveling theory, as in the Saidian tradition, and Gilroy and Jim Clifford and all these other writers at the time period, I also want us to think through, if we're thinking about so much about movement, how then do we understand the relationship to place, right? So does place always then become backdrop, right? And so I think this is something important to think through, particularly in relationship to the energy humanities, because engaging with a kind of the spirit of place, or the ghosts of place, or the ancestors of place, or the kind of the animated element of place itself may mean a resistance to a certain kind of mobility, right? Or maybe, to put it, as Jennifer mentioned before, in a dialectic, right? And so to have that kind of ability to think through what is your responsibility to place in the wake of constant migration, right? Whether it's, and it's not to say migrations are always voluntary, mostly they're not, right? The vast majority are not, but to think through what are those kind of attachments then by celebrating. And so I have some quotes from Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari, who were all about, oh, everything's about movement and mobility and all that. But in that framing, it's a particularly kind of masculine model that actually doesn't incorporate other ontologies of place.
Maybe I can follow that because some of my thinking echoes what you just ended with. And as you were asking the question, I was thinking, I think it's a very difficult question. That's what I was thinking initially. And then I think the first text that came to mind that kind of fits the criteria you gave us was Sarah Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology, which actually is also kind of linked to the question of representation and narrative that you were inquiring into a little earlier, where she gives a very simple example studying sort of Husserl's writing table, or the way he describes his writing table as something that's very neat and as something that has certain kinds of objects placed on it that helps, and all those objects help his production. And Sarah Ahmed in the book asks what happens behind the writing table. So actually, how is that table kept as neat and clean as it is? And so in some ways, she's making a move to sort of question the various invisibilities of that domestic space, that emerge in that domestic space, to then ask how are certain kinds of practices of maintenance and care represented in the ways in which we imagine knowledge production, and perhaps the connection might not be as direct to sort of how we think about energy infrastructure, but then our earlier discussion somehow showed the ways in which invisibilization and visibilization might also have links to sort of feminist critiques of practice and feminist critiques of colonialism. So the the ways in which those travel are somehow up to us, I think, in this case. Yeah.
I think I'd answer the question by circling back to Hannah's account of her training, which for me resonated in some ways, but also differed in some ways. I did my graduate training, my PhD, in the 90s at the University of Texas at Austin in literature. And I was in a pretty unique program that at another university might have been described as post-colonial studies, but at the University of Texas at Austin, it was described as ethnic and third world literatures. In other words, bringing together the literatures of minoritized communities in the United States with the literatures of the formerly colonized world, right? So third world in the radical sense of choosing an alternative to the Cold War binary powers. And so the Ethnic and Third World Literatures program saw itself very explicitly in opposition to then ascendant post-colonial studies. And we kind of aspired to be a radical alternative to what was happening in New York, where I now teach at Columbia. And so I think one of the things that was really powerful about that training, that was grounded in anti-colonial national liberation theorists like Césaire, Fanon, Cabral, etc., was that we understood very well, both because of the US perspective, but then also because of that third world perspective, that even if you want to call it post-colonial, it doesn't mean that decolonization meant liberation, right? That we understood that, there was not the term really circulating in the 90s, coloniality, but what we were talking about was coloniality. And so I guess in order to get a job and at the end of the 90s, I had to kind of present myself as a post-colonialist, but in the sense of thinking about the ways in which empire continues. And so I continue to refer to those thinkers who were at the heart of my training as anti-colonial thinkers. I don't really think of myself as working as a decolonial theorist, but I think it's this kind of inside baseball distinctions that maybe are not so important to a lot of folks. I think Edward Said is another person who's been really formative for me, and it came to mind, I think, when Dean Masri was talking I think one of the ideas that I take from Said is that whatever has been made by humans can be made otherwise. And then I think another thing that I would say, just in terms of the ways that we make things move, is that even though I trained in this E3W program, I didn't really write about the United States. I should have said I trained as a scholar of African and South Asian literature in English, so I was mostly writing about Anglophone Africa and South Asia. I didn't really write about the US or North America until I started working on energy humanities. And so it was kind of a process of following the pipeline, right, to understand myself as a US citizen, a US-based academic, and at one heart of the energy industry. So, I mean, I guess the last thing that I would say about, our training and the genealogies that it's connected to, again, it's connected to something that Dean Masri said, quoting from Marti, about the substitution of masters, right? That's kind of, decolonization without liberation. And when he said that, it struck me immediately that I think when we're thinking about energy transition, it's too often a substitution of fuels, right? Same relations, new fuels, but then, I forget who was talking about whale oil, was it? Yeah, Gökçe. Then I realized it's not even a substitution of masters or fuels. It's a proliferation of masters and fuels, right? So we have one fuel added to another, whale oil, fossil fuels, nuclear, wind, the energy transition almost never involves stopping using a fuel, and then we can think about how new masters have arisen alongside and in cooperation often with old masters.
Yeah, I mean, I think in our conversations with students, we came to describe transition as something we called an anti-keyword, drawing on the keywords tradition of the humanities and sort of thinking about these concepts which I think particularly critical attention needed to be paid to. I did not wear a watch. A terrible example to my students.
I can tell you what it is.
Yes, and Joy was also flagging to me that I had 5 minutes left, so I apologize for having monopolized more of the time. I had even more difficult questions to pose to them, but I think I want to try and take a few that we can sort of bring forward and maybe just have everyone give some final remarks. Maybe we'll take 3 questions and use that as a jumping off point for things. So maybe if we could start with John and then Haidar behind him.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'd like to just point out that I hope we're not just talking about energy from resources, but we're also talking about human energy and the ways to rethink about it. Someone has mentioned, for example, Filipino laborers in the oil rigs, and I wanted to ask, what does it mean to decolonize human energy, especially in the migration context? The US, for example, transformed the Philippines into a country that exports nurses, right? What does it mean for nurses and their energies, for example, to be decolonized?
Thank you so much for your time. My question sort of also revolves around the idea of energy consumption almost in everyday, so basically my question is especially in the global south, energy consumption is just as important to everyday class dynamics and lives as the production is. We've been talking about oil rigs and Masdar and all of these places. But in places like Pakistan, energy, your energy bill is higher than your rent. So people are buying solar panels now because it's cheaper, and it's gotten to the point where the Pakistani government can't pay off its debts to the IMF because people are now transitioning away from centralized systems. So how does this energy moment reproduce or modify class dynamics in the global south and on an everyday basis?
And then do we have one more question? Sorry, is there a hand back here in the green? Oh, sorry. Okay, right here.
Hi. My question is, in your view, what would a just transition look like for oil-dependent countries such as Libya, Nigeria, or Angola?
Right, thank you. Also want to be especially thankful for concise but thought-provoking questions. So I'll give our last few minutes back to each of the speakers if you want to just sort of give any thoughts you have on those questions or any final remarks.
I can quickly respond to the second question because this was something that I was asking over the last few years, and one of the reasons why a floating power plant was deployed in Ghana in 2015 was because there was an electricity sort of crisis between 2012 and 2015, and in that process, many people who could afford solar panels put solar panels on their roofs. And this was initially celebrated as a significant success, but then what I found while I was looking at sort of the transformation of the electricity grid there was how the production of rooftop panels and the sort of the retreat of the upper middle class or like consumers from the grid meant that the grid was now, that electricity prices were now even more expensive. And so for people who couldn't afford electricity became even a more inaccessible good. And there's a common term for this is called the utility death spiral, meaning the utility is no longer able to support itself because its most prized sort of consumers are not necessarily participating because they don't think that the grid is reliable. So I think it creates I don't have necessarily a solution to this problem, but I think it's important to address that the things that we, again, maybe perhaps are visible to us and that we celebrate might have, results that we don't always anticipate, and that, and in terms of class dynamics as well, might create further inequalities in the system. Yeah.
I mean, I guess I can answer some of the questions in terms of energy and climate justice. And I'm mindful sitting here of my usual position in the United States, right? Which is, and so the teaching I do, I think, is about asking students to think about themselves not only as energy consumers, but as connected then to energy producers. And so, I think that for me, energy justice is about at least two things. One is about the kind of uneven distribution of benefits and burdens, right? So the harms to communities at sites of extraction is an aspect of energy injustice, but also the uneven distribution of energy itself, right? And so we can think of the challenge or a challenge of energy and climate justice is, for most of my students in the United States, I think energy justice entails probably using less energy. But then the other side of energy justice are, communities around the world who are arguably, need to use more energy, that they don't have access to energy. And so in terms of climate justice, I think the question is how to think about increasing energy equity and rolling out renewables at the same time, with all of the things that we know about the difficulty of renewables, that they're not a free lunch. And I think my own work is not so much about energy, human energy, which we might also call labor, but I think in terms of thinking about what the future looks like, one way of thinking about labor is not so much that human labor is replaced by machines, but thinking about the forms of labor that constellate around different energy regimes and how to bring those laborers along as transition or transformation, energy transformations continue in the years ahead.
I can add something to that. And I'll go back actually to, so this is in a vague response. First, thanks for the questions, which are all very hard, and I think if anyone had any direct solutions, we would be in a different situation. So I appreciate the attention that everyone is thinking through different comparative ways that we need to think about this, and how we do, what different contexts and who becomes visible and who becomes invisible, particularly around circuits of gendered care. And I wanted to circle back to that in particular because last fall, Amitav Ghosh was doing a series of lectures in Munich where I was in residency, and he gave a lecture, which I don't think has been printed yet, but essentially was a critique of all the tech bros and all of their desires to, transcend Earth, right? It's entirely the opposite of, what Donna Haraway talks about in terms of like being a creature of the mud, not a creature of the sky, right? And to kind of think through what it means to be embedded and part and parcel, and thinking through, the food systems that feed you, the care systems that feed you, the care systems that allow us to be here, right? And so one of the critiques that he's made is that all of these tech bros who are creating these utopian, libertarian, seasteading societies on the planet, there's one in off the coast of Honduras. There's another one they tried to set up. This is Peter Thiel out in off the coast of in French Polynesia, and then of course Mars is their ultimate destination. I wish them the best. I hope they exactly. So, but the thing is that Amitav had made mention in his lecture is that these are structures that are entirely dependent on so much invisible labor. So they're going to get to Mars, but who's going to be the nanny to take care of their children? Who's going to be the teacher to educate the children? Who's going to be cleaning their kitchens? Who's going to be preparing their food? Who's going to be growing their food, right? So to think through these other labors of care, right? And I think for me, a lot of the feminist materialist work on care and thinking through care, and that's also a very important element of Indigenous studies, is to think through these kind of aspects of indebtedness and reciprocity in care. And I think those kinds of discourses allow us to have a broader interaction and understanding of our embeddedness in relation, rather than a more vertical one in which certain kinds of labor are then made invisible.
Yeah. Let me preface my remarks by saying that I am infamous in circles I run in for being overly optimistic. So let me just start by saying that, so all of you know that about me. But first to this question of labor, or of the human expense of energy. And this is true of the Philippines, but this is true of many places in the world, including, of course, people from the United States in the United States, people from Mexico, Central America in the United States right now, right, facing extraordinary violence, being kidnapped off the streets by masked military men. So this has been a particular kind of pressing problem in the Philippines for a long time, but it is obviously more broad than that. And I do think, maybe I'll also preface my remarks by saying I spend a lot of my time doing political organizing. And I do think that we are in a moment of resurgence of the understanding of collective power, right? We're with Peter Thiel and Elon Musk when we're thinking about Mars, but we're also, of course, with Jeff Bezos. And as these people become the world's first trillionaires, you see at the same time people all along the Amazon supply chain starting to organize, starting to build unions, when the corporate form that those people have built was specifically designed to avoid collective struggle and collective power. And that's also true of subcontracting, right? That's also true of transnational subcontracting. Part of the magic of the offshore, part of the firstly of the offshore, was in fact to avoid what happened at Saudi Aramco, right? When Saudi Aramco nationalized and all of the workers organized and said, we no longer want to be treated as second-class citizens. We don't want the white people over there living in those nice houses and us living over here in tents on sand, right? And they organized and nationalized what we now know as Saudi Aramco. So the oil industry is haunted by those pasts of collective struggle and of nationalization, and they have intentionally used the secondly of, oh look, now we're offshore, right? Mexico, same thing, massive nationalization drive in the Mexican oil and gas industry historically, to make unionization less possible. because those workers from Venezuela, from the Philippines, from Kazakhstan that fly in and out to those rigs, they don't then go to church together on Sunday, right? They don't then have space away. Those rigs are little floating atolls, and you don't have space. You're always under the watchful eye of the boss, and people speak all kinds of languages on those rigs. It's very difficult to organize for your conditions collectively when some of you are from the Philippines, and some of you are from Venezuela, and some of you are from Ecuador, and you're flying in and out maybe every 2 weeks, maybe every month, back and forth to where you're from. What happens on offshore oil rigs is slightly different, for example, from nursing labor. But one of the strongest unions in the United States, broadly, and in California specifically, is broadly, or nationally, it's called the National Nurses Union. And in California, it's called CNA, the California Nurses Association. The rank and file organizing members of that union are Filipina. They are Filipina nurses. I'm also thinking, if I think in the Philippines, I think about the Filipino Movement for Climate Justice, right? PMCJ, one of the strongest climate justice organizations that I know of anywhere. And so I actually think that as we come to this moment of pitched battles over governance in the United States, but certainly elsewhere, right? Rising fascism, I would argue. I actually think that we are going to see more worker organizing, and that collective action and collectivizing the struggle is the answer both to this question and to the question about energy transitions, right? Because to me, a just transition is so much about these questions of multiple energies, multiple masters. We know what extraction has looked like, whether it's hydrocarbons or lithium, right? And so part of that is that people need to democratize those supply chains, and the people that need to democratize the supply chains are not the masters of them, right? The people they are the workers in them. And it is currently set up in such a transnational way as to make that difficult, very intentionally, but I think that that is the answer to both of those questions. And I want to talk about Israel and the 6-Day War and Pakistan, but I'm gonna stop.
I wish we could keep going for longer, but fortunately we have time throughout the day to continue these discussions. So we're couple of minutes over time. I see the next session was supposed to start at 10:45, but maybe we can push that to 10:50 to allow everyone to get a drink and rest for a couple of minutes. That session has now been moved because of the interest to this room, so you don't actually have to go anywhere. You can stay here. And that will be Thinking Energy from the Ground Up, Methodologies for Critical Social Research. And we'll reconvene for that at 10:50. But please join me in thanking our panelists one more time.